Hey, what is up, guys? Kolst here. So we have a very special topic today, which I'm very excited about because it is tempo. And what is tempo exactly? We'll get into that a little bit later. But tempo is the single most important thing, in my opinion, to understand as far as, differentiating yourself, as far as skill in arena, getting the highest average, winning games. Because I've seen people that have been playing this game for years, maybe since like 2015 even, and in my opinion, they still don't understand this topic as well as they probably should, and it's kind of clear that it's holding them back. So I want to make sure this situation doesn't happen to you. And I think this goes as well for people that are even like, legend level players in constructed. Frankly, I mean, if you look at a lot of constructed decks nowadays, a lot of them don't care about tempo at all, frankly. So even players that are very high level constructed come not really having developed the skill. And I don't think you can really be a near infinite player without really being an expert at tempo. And since this is a very difficult topic, I'll do my best to thoroughly explain the concept and use some examples to, illustrate everything. So as an outline here, first I'll explain exactly what is tempo, why it's so important, use some examples, and then go into some more advanced topics such as delayed tempo. And by the way, if you have any ideas on what other kind of topics I can go over, definitely leave in the comment section. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video and all that stuff. But without further ado, let's get right into it. Alright, so the first topic, what is tempo? Well, tempo is the most consistent and prevalent win condition in Arena, but it's actually a little difficult to define exactly what tempo is. It represents the general development of your board relative to your opponent's board for the game, or basically like the game state. It's hard to define exactly, but you can represent it roughly through a few different ways. So one way you can represent tempo, the most basic way, is just the amount of raw attack power you have on your board. So you have a 4 attack minion, a 3 attack minion, and a 2 attack minion. That adds up to 9. You have 9 tempo. That's the most basic way. But, there's flaws to that. Your opponent, your 4 or 5, your 4 attack minion could be a 4 or 5, or it could be a 4-1. So that it would be much easier to deal with if it has less health, right? So that way is a little flawed, but it is the most relevant to how much damage you can deal. So a more accurate way often is you think about as the mana value of the stats on the board. So like a 4 or 5 is a 4 mana minion, right? A 3-4 would be a 3 mana minion. A 4-1 would only be like, maybe a 1 or 2. So oftentimes that would be a more accurate way of viewing it. So then, if you have the similar board state, we have a 4-5, a 3-4, and a 3-2, you can say, okay, well, that's a 4 drop, a 3 drop, and a 2 drop. You essentially have 9 mana on your board. And I find this being a pretty useful way of viewing it because, generally speaking, like if you have this board, say you just played minions on curve and your opponent didn't do anything, you're 9 mana ahead and they only have 4 or 5 mana to respond. So generally speaking, your swings are rather limited to how much mana you have available. So once you've gotten more ahead than your opponent has mana to spend to deal with it, you usually have a huge advantage. And the other thing, which I think is honestly the hardest to measure directly, is the value of how sticky your board is. So this is represented through just how many death rattles, divine shields, things like that are on your board. So making your board much more resilient and difficult to deal with for your opponent. So exactly what the tempo situation is going to be isn't just dependent on exactly, what stats or sum of stats or whatever you have on the board, or even the distribution of the stats. It's going to depend on what trades either player has available, depending on who has initiative, and also what answers your opponent may have in their hand. So for example, different board states are going to be very much better against certain classes than others. If you have a board full of Chillwind Yetis, imagine seven Chillwind Yetis. If you're against like a Druid probably doesn't have an answer to that. You're probably gonna kill them in 2 turns. But if it's a mage who has 7 mana available, it might not work out quite so well. Alright, so now that we've introduced the basic concept of what tempo is, we're gonna go into a little deeper why exactly tempo is so important. And there are the two biggest reasons why tempo is so important is because of the initiative you gain from it, and also the pressure that you're able to apply directly to your opponent through damage to their face. And this is a huge part of the reason why going first is such a big advantage. You just get to play your thing first and you get to attack with it first due to, minions having summoning sickness in this game. And dictating trades is able to provide both value and additional tempo. We're going to use a very specific example for this here. So imagine your opponent has a 5-6 and a 3-4 on their board, and you have a 4-5 and a 3-2. Who has the better board here? Well, pretty much by pretty much every estimate you can do, they have a better board. Their minions are bigger than yours, they have more attack, they have more health. It's just a better board, right? But let's say that you have the ability to attack before their minions do. So your 4-5 is able to take that value trade of the 3-4, and then suddenly you have a 4-2 and a 3-2 against their 5-6. That's actually an even, those minions trade evenly with each other, so you're actually no longer behind on board. Even though you had a strictly inferior board essentially, you're now doing totally fine, and if it's your turn, you can also probably develop more stuff, maybe something that matches the 5-6 evenly as well. So you're actually suddenly winning, potentially. Where if your opponent was able to attack first, their 5-6 eats your 4-5, their 3-4 eats your 3-2. They develop more on board, and you're getting blown out of this game. And you need some kind of a mass comeback effect, or you probably will lose the game in a couple turns. And the second big reason, as I stated earlier, is direct pressure. Again, like, you know, if your minions have nothing they need to trade into, then they can just go directly into your opponent's base. And let's not forget that Hearthstone does have an objective, which is set your opponent from 30 health to 0. So one thing that can be really big to decide the outcome of a game is just say you get an early minion, like a 2-mana 3-2 or something. Well, that doesn't look that scary, but if that thing just remains unmatched for the entire game, that thing just keeps going face, 3 damage, 3 damage, 3 damage, that really adds up, and suddenly, you know, you realize at turn 7 that thing's already dealt 15 damage, more than some big late game minion would have done. A lot of times the value in a big late game minion is just that they can guarantee one big face hit if your opponent isn't able to deal with it, you know, something sticky, that like a Plague Proto Drake, a Violet Worm, something like that. But that would only be like 7 or 8 damage. This little Bloodfang Raptor has already done double that, right? Which is why the early tempo, again, it can be so important. But the other thing to keep in mind, kind of related to this, is just how quickly, if you lose a board, it can just kill you. Especially in the later turns once your opponent has a bunch of mana available. If they're playing like 8 to 10 mana worth of minions, they'll often have like 10 attack. 10 is a third of your health, right? So the common mistake you see is I might be playing against an opponent, I might have like 1 card in my hand and they might have 8, and they keep discovering, generating more value, whatever, and I just build up a board that they can't deal with, and then they lose with their hand being full. And it's like, well, that didn't work out too well for you, right? You have to keep in mind, even if you're trying to be more of the value-oriented thing, you cannot, at the very least, you don't want to fall too far behind. And the other part of understanding tempo, again, even if you're a value-oriented deck, is it's very important to just understand tempo, to understand exactly how and when you should be using your removal and your initiative. Because sometimes, you know, there is a trade-off between maximizing your tempo on any given turn and managing your resources, using them at the right moment, or using them for the highest value. I think value and resource management will be a whole topic for another video, but it is worth noting that oftentimes these do come at ends and there's a trade-off and you have to make a difficult decision. And one critical thing is that the tempo you can provide from your minions can just, it pressures your opponent, and if you don't provide any pressure, they might have too much time and be too comfortable to pull off combos and do things that will just win them the game, where if you keep pressuring them, you just don't give them the time, your opponent may have to use their resources suboptimally, can't combo things properly, and even if you don't kill them directly with the damage, that pressure can still win you games. And this is a common thing you see in Arena sometimes when someone asks, like, man, look at how crazy this guy's deck was, I couldn't have beaten that. It's like, well, yeah, because you gave them the time to pull off, do all their crazy stuff, then you couldn't, at that point you couldn't do anything. But if you had pressured them, you'd forced more damage, didn't give them the time, then you might have been able to stop them. And especially if you're trying to have a high win average, you have to, frankly, you have to understand that on average, your opponent's gonna have a better deck than you. That's just how it is. So that's part of why playing for tempo is often going to be the most consistent way to get the highest wins, because it's kind of the equalizing factor when your opponent, you can't always guarantee that you have better cards than your opponent. Playing for value works great when you have the far superior deck, and your opponent doesn't, you know, push insane tempo to kill you either. But when if you're trying to play a value game against a better value deck, it's just, it doesn't matter how much better you are than your opponent, it's just not going to work most of the time. So now that we've gone over a lot of these concepts, let's talk about a couple specific examples. So for our first example, I'm going to look at 3 different 3-drops in the game. I'll ask you the question of which one of these do you think is the highest tempo? So we have Sunwell Initiate, Injured Blade Master, and Devouring Ectoplasm. If you want to think about that for a second, you can pause the video. But the answer here is, it depends. So I didn't provide you really with any information about what the board state is. If you assume that, so for example, like if you assume that's turn 3, you know, the Sunwell Initiate is a very strong minion on turn 3. That's why it does perform so well, because often it will be able to get its Divine Shield. But let's go back to some of the other concepts. Do you expect that this minion is going to be unanswered, essentially? Because in that case, you know, Injured Blade Master has the most attack. It has 4 attack compared to the others 3. That might be the highest tempo minion if your opponent doesn't do anything about it, but that's the thing. But on average, you know, your opponent might be able to deal with it, so it's often actually the lowest tempo out of these 3. So the question is, will your opponent have an ability to deal 4 damage easily? In which case, if they don't, then the Sunwell Initiate, which often happens if this is like on turn 3, then the Sunwell Initiate will often be the best. The other question is, do they just happen to have the right removal to deal with the Devouring Ectoplasm? If they don't, you know, something like Devouring Ectoplasm can just be extremely, extremely annoying. They don't have exactly 2 damage. And again, do they have exactly 3 damage to deal with the Blade Master? If this Blade Master sticks, do you have the ability to actually heal it? Because, you know, you could heal it to potentially full health and then suddenly get way extra value. Do you have an ability to buff up your Sunwell Initiate? If they try to match it with a 4-3 or a 3-4, can you buff it to make it a 4-5 and then, you know, take whatever value trade they don't expect you to be able to make and get a whole bunch of extra tempo? Does your opponent have the ability to do some kind of mass AoE? Like even into your opponent's turn 4, they might have the ability to play something like Soul Rend, which is going to wipe out anything except for the Devouring Ectoplasm. Then at least, you know, something will stick around. I didn't mention as well, does your opponent have a board already? Do they have a 2-3 that your Sunwell Initiate could already eat, which would, you know, be much worse against the Devouring Ectoplasm? Do you have additional minions that you're pushing with as well, making you more vulnerable to that Soul Rend? These are all things that are going to impact your decision here of which 3-drop you might want to play. And especially on early turns, you probably won't know, but another advanced concept is, do you have a read into what your opponent has? I might make a whole video eventually on making reads. I'm not exactly sure how I can do that. It's a very difficult concept to explain, but at some point I may try to tackle it. But regardless, even if you don't know, you can, essentially what you would want to do is play the odds. You know, good chance on turn 3. If you have something like a Sunwell Initiate, you'd want to play it as soon as possible, because it's not exactly going to get better if you wait. Depending on which class you're playing against, you can play the odds a little bit. I talk about that a bit in my returning player guide, which I'll link, but essentially, you know, like just one example, which I believe I used in that video, is a warrior is very likely to be able to deal 3 damage on turn 4 with something like a Sword Eater, Outrider's Axe, that kind of stuff. I go more in depth on that concept in that video though. Our next example, just talk about a specific minion, our old friend. So is this a high tempo minion we're looking at right here, Mr. Patriarch? You can think about it if you want, but the short answer is usually not, right? Obviously. A lot of times a 1-4 might not even be worth 2 mana. But again, it does depend. Does your opponent have 2 3-1s on board by any chance? And if they do they have the ability to ping from hand? Because if they don't, then suddenly this thing might actually do extremely, extremely well. But again, like what if they have something like a fishy flyer, like a 4 damage rush or something, then even if it looks really good, you get obliterated, right? This just gets into the general concept that most of the time, unless you can really kind of like keep your opponent off board, drain their initiative, and control the game state really well, having these kind of really aggressive statted, like really high low health or really defensive statted minions, just they're generally a lot less consistent. A lot of times, you know, the minions that do best are going to be roughly, you know, neutral statted or potentially slightly defensive statted. So, you know, something like if you have like a 4-7 or something, can probably eat, you know, maybe 1 or 2 smaller minions, so slightly defensive stat minions. will also do pretty well, but not too defensively statted. Otherwise, they're kind of useless. But one thing to think about, which I think a lot of people don't tend to think about, is that the more aggressive your deck wants to be, the more you should probably favor slightly more aggressive statted minions, because you want to be able to actually deal face damage to your opponent. If you have too many defensive statted minions, you can have complete utter board control, but then your opponent playing the control side will just, wait, and then, they'll just blow up your entire board, and then, you're just kind of screwed, right? It ends up making you more vulnerable to AoE in the future. Even if, again, you would think that your defensive statted minions are less prone to being AoE'd, which is true immediately, but once they've traded into something, then all of a sudden they're in the range that an AoE would wipe them out, right? So you do want generally to have, in these aggressive stat decks, you do want to have some kind of high health minions just to make sure the clear doesn't wipe you completely off the board. But that's one thing, is exactly how you time when you play these minions is extremely important, because you really want to play them on the turn that your opponent wants to clear you, so that you can still maintain a board advantage, continue to provide pressure through the board clear. And that's going to lead us somewhat into our next topic, which is delayed tempo. There are a lot of forms of this in the game now. Blizzard's been implementing a lot more of these, especially in the last year, because, when too many minions are just stats or just, battle cry effects, whatever, it makes the game kind of curbstone-y, right? So they've been introducing a lot of these kind of powerful but delayed effects to try to compensate and combat this. So the most direct form of delayed tempo is ramp, which is literally mana gain, but only Druid really does this. They play like a wild growth or an overgrowth, whatever, and then they get more mana in the future. But there are a lot of other forms here. There are like discounts, which are cards that you might pay mana for, and then it makes a future card cheaper. Just an example is like the studies cards. You discover a card and make cards of that type cheaper. You have like the corrupt effect, where the card, if you're not familiar with corrupt, you play a card more expensive than it while it's in your hand, and then the card just gets stronger somehow. Or you also have hand buffs like Claw Machine, or like, a lot of the Paladin cards they've been printing lately. So it makes you may have to do a slightly slower tempo play, but then you make your hand bigger. Also, conditioning from Warrior is a huge one. You also have dormants, so minions that you have to you play them, but they just stick on board for a while, and then you get some kind of effect later. You get the minion later. Other kinds of more indirect ramp, you have, weapons. Weapons, you get to swing them the turn you play them, so they are initiative, but also you don't really get typically enough value for the card on the turn you play it. You are expecting to get more value on later turns. So over multiple turns, weapons will generally be higher value than comparable other cards for their cost. And also some extremely indirect forms of ramp are like death rattles, just, effects that you get later, or just generally speaking, discover and draw. These are kind of ramp effects because you have to pay for them, but then the expectation is that you'll have better options later, so you might be able to produce a swing from them. So there's a few main ways you want to utilize these kind of delayed tempo effects. So you want to, generally, again, you want to have a stronger turn in the future. There are a few reasons you might want to do that. So just by having one really, really strong turn in the future, you might just get really far ahead to the point where, your opponent just isn't able to deal with it immediately. And then maybe you use that advantage to push just critical damage, get them low, or outright destroy the enemy hero to, win the game. Using these kind of delayed tempo mechanics would be a great way to do that, because often, just the cards that you can play in one turn aren't really going to accomplish this by themselves. There's very few cards that are strong enough to do that themselves. So there's that. Or the other way is to maintain an advantage through an opponent's swing. So, if you know that your opponent is probably going to board clear you, say that it's a warlock that's been kind of doing nothing, and you think they're about to be able to play Twisting Nether, they're a mage with Flame Strike, whatever, then you can try to invest more into some of these kind of delayed tempo effects, or, play a dormant minion, play a weapon, just start drawing instead of playing your maximum tempo minions, or just play even just a really high health minion instead of, you know, things that would be more, you know, more tempo, quote unquote, to make sure that if they do board clear you, and if it's not like a Twisting Nether, you know, if they flame strike you, at least your big minion will survive and still be able to push that little bit of extra damage that you might need. Alright, so that's all the topics I had for this video. If you made it this far, you're awesome, and remember that. But thanks a lot for hanging out. If you want some more examples of, you know, me applying these concepts, you can basically look at any run on my channel, because I generally am a very heavy tempo player, so I'm always maximizing these kinds of stuff. Yeah, again, if you have any other comments on anything else you'd want to see as part of these kind of instructional videos, definitely make sure to leave that feedback in the comment section below, or just leave any comment, because they all help the algorithm, and we all praise the YouTube algorithm, right? That's why we are all here. But yeah, to help the algorithm as well, don't forget to like the video and subscribe and all that stuff. And you can also check me out on Twitch, where I can answer some of your questions if you happen to have any questions, and maybe I'll answer them live. Yeah, thanks a lot, everyone. Again, we will see you guys in the next one.